We're going to go to Batya now. So Batya Weinbaum is from the USA. She's a feminist, author, and educator, founder and editor of the journal Femspec. She's an online instructor at American Public University. So thank you so much that you're going to talk about your experience of teaching early 21st century women and gender studies in an elite Southeastern American university, including the erasure of radical feminism and women's history from the curriculum and the effect this is having on young people in the university. So over to you, Batya.
Yeah, so I want everyone on this network to know that this is a publication which is very supportive of this perspective that I've been sharing over the last couple months since I've been involved. And anybody who has stories or information or research might want to consider submitting to these people. It's a fine group of women very committed to this same struggle. And I was luckily connected with them for other reasons when I was teaching at a university, which I won't name. And I was invited to teach a capstone theory course about feminism, and I experienced a lot of bullying when I was there because my ideology was not in conformist lines with the kind of thinking that the department had. And I think also that my position in the university was compromised by being an adjunct. And I think that this has a terrible impact on women and girls because the majority of adjuncts are women. And so we have less freedom of speech and less academic freedom. And the consequences of obliterating radical feminism as a theoretical approach to teach from is that our freedom as scholars is impinged upon, and we can't do our research and we can't do our teaching and we can't do our thinking. It began for me when I was developing my my syllabus, and I was told, why didn't I have an anthology? And I did have an anthology. I had this anthology called Radical Feminism, and I was said to, why didn't I have this? Why didn't I have that? And I had a very historically developed approach about teaching what feminism was. And it didn't come to loggerheads until I was actually in the classroom. And the way I was teaching was to use Monica Saju and Barbara Moore's book on Great Cosmic Mother. And it started off, I started off with Ursula Le Guin, but once I started with the Great Cosmic Mother, the conflict started in the class because there were both men and women in the class. It was largely women. I asked them to turn a note card in the beginning of the class, telling me something significant about themselves that they wanted me to know. Nobody declared any pronoun or anything that they wanted me to address them as. But later I was called on the carpet for calling people with the wrong pronouns, but they had had a chance to declare to me what pronouns they wanted to call themselves. But the student complaint started when I was teaching the Great Cosmic Mother. And it took me a while to understand that because of the trans ideology, the starting point of women as reproducers was an uncomfortable, unpopular starting point. I was teaching not only the Great Cosmic Mother, but I was having them do artwork based on the images in the book and intuitively connecting with these archetypes. And so my way of teaching was also not supported. But the most important thing was the next book was about Elizabeth Barber's women's work, the first 20,000 years. And she has an analysis of how women's participation in the workforce was organized around their birthing and ability to take care of children. And so for, 20,000 years, this was how we arrived at our position in the work world. And this was resisted too, because people wanted to say that women weren't being defined by their wombs because women didn't have to have a vagina to be a woman. And, all this ideology started seeping back up towards me in the classroom, which was at odds with what I was teaching. And best analogy I can make is if you're teaching German history and then somebody keeps wanting to talk about what's going on in Latin America, or if you're teaching trigonometry and somebody wants to talk about nuclear physics. I mean, there was a project going on in the course that I was starting with there was a time when women's reproductive power was a power, and if we trace it all the way through patriarchal society, it gets diminished and defined as a liability, to the point where feminist theorists like Shumath Firestone were saying we'd be better off with artificial wombs. And I was trying to pull this thread, across thousands of years, across the millennial, but I wasn't allowed to. And one of the ways in which the class was disrupted was the way I taught was to invite people to do footnotes, so that when topics came up in the class that people wanted to know more about, they could get credit, or it was an assignment that they had to do a footnote, further research on something that came up in class. And so at one point, this worked for most people, but there was a little a group of people that were starting to criticize me for defining women in essentialist terms as being bearers of children and being defined by reproduction in their wombs. I was criticized for being essentialist, but I want to point out that essentialism was really a Greek term among male philosophers. And in terms of when feminists started using the term essentialist to attack other feminists, it was when they started to get integrated into the university and were using male ideological systems to sort of diminish the revolutionary cutting edge of many feminists who were in the university trying to pursue feminist revolution rather than to, structure a professional discipline of women's studies. And so by the time I was there, there was just a very disruptive. I would teach, and then some of the students would go to complain to the women's studies director, and she would get back to me and start telling me how I should teach in the classroom, and what I should say and what I shouldn't say. I shouldn't talk from personal experience. I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't do that. And the footnote problem became an issue because there was a student who wanted to do her presentation on Gender Outlaw, which was a book of collections of really the trans experience. And she wanted to make the argument that the work of passing as women was so difficult that this was part of women's work, which had nothing to do with the classroom. I mean, I could have taught a whole course on the trans movement, but that's not what I was teaching about. So I was saying, well, I don't really think, that's relevant. And then I was confronted in the class. Well, yes, there's many ways you can spin this. So the students were telling me what was acceptable and what was necessary to include. And the day that the students gave, this one student and then the cohort of supporters, I gave this presentation on Gender Outlaw. There was a quote that somebody said in the presentation that it was so much work to pass as a woman, forget the movement. And I picked up on that, and I said, yeah, that's the exact criticism that radical feminists have made, is that there's so much work towards trying to pass, all of this is a deflection from the feminist movement, which is trying to change patriarchy and change patriarchal models and change patriarchal roles, rather than having to work to fit into them, flipping from one to the other. And believe it or not, that was the last day that I was allowed to teach. The next thing I knew, I was told to meet in the chair's office with the director of women's studies, and I was not aware of what was happening at all. And I was simply told that I was going to be removed from the classroom. And at this point, it wasn't even that I was removed from that classroom, but I was smeared with an email that the director of women's studies sent not only to this entire class about why I had to be removed, but to another class that I was teaching with a lot of success, the Introduction to Women and Gender Studies, that I was teaching online. And those students were confused as to why they got an attack from the director of Women and Gender Studies about me. But when I was meeting with the chair of the department and the director of Women's Studies, we were inside a sociology department. I was suggesting that some of the dissidence of the students was based on the fact that they weren't following through with the course, but were trying to change what was going on in the course, and that the ideology that they were expressing would get a chance to be discussed towards the end of the course when we finally got there and talked about the role of technology in altering gender roles. And the chair actually said, well, they have their own culture. So the whole administration was more of, afraid of the students and interested in placating the culture of the students than in actually performing education. And the detriment on women and girls is that all of this women's work, the first 20,000 years, the radical feminist anthology, all of these topics were just thrown out. And the students, by declaring what they thought should be taught, which I'm usually a student-centered teacher, so it's not that I'm not interested in listening to students, but this particular cadre of students really, in my view, interfered with the education of other people in the class, because this kind of thinking, this kind of approach that I was ready to offer was not acceptable. And the chair from the outside was telling me that I had to conform to whatever culture the students had, which is not really what education is supposed to be about. From my point of view, I mean, that maybe I date myself, but I was in the university to learn from the professors that I had and was impressed with their knowledge. And these students just didn't have that perspective at all. And the problem is that I was talking about women based on women's bodies being organized around reproduction. And this was reprehensible to the trans cult ideology, which was saying that women's bodies had nothing to do with whether women were women or not. And so at any rate, in conclusion, I think that it's really a shame that women in gender studies students are not learning radical feminism, and that radical feminism is being eradicated and teachers are being thrown out. I wasn't hired again, actually, after this. And that the institutionalized postmodern, post-feminist women in gender studies doesn't recognize that radical feminists have anything to teach. And my position is that sometimes it's better to ask students to grow up rather than to coddle and to placate them and to allow them to bully a professor. And that sometimes educating students beyond what they already think might be good for them. I even offered to do a whole course on female erasure based on that anthology, Female Erasure, which follows the conflicts between feminism and the transgender movement, in very specific ways, and theoretical ways, and political ways. But it seems that the burying of radical feminist thought from the current students of women in gender studies might be a disservice to the development of feminist consciousness as a whole, because women in gender studies, after all, got its origin from the impetus of the women's movement. And so to eclipse the origins of the women's movement from what happens in women in gender studies, to cut it off at the base and then to flip it and to only allow the transgender discussions to go on in the classroom is just an incredible disservice, because the students don't even know why they're there. They don't even know why those classrooms were created. So I don't see how feminist consciousness is being developed when this is allowed to go on in the classroom. And they look at people like me or people from our generation or people with radical feminist thinking as people who are, leftovers, dinosaurs that are about to be buried by the iceberg. And that's just a funny twist, because radical feminists used to be accused of being ahistorical, and now radical feminists are being told that they're too historical, and we want to just teach about the past 50 years. We don't want to teach about 250,000 years that led up to the past 50 years. And so the other issue I found was that inclusivity meant to the current women in gender studies to include trans people and trans ideology, and not to include a whole wide range of feminists or women who might be able to read and use theory outside of the universities. Is a very truncated view of what women in gender studies is. And that I think the aggressive actions of some pushing of the trans line deprives other students of processes that broaden and deepen their education. And this is a real detriment. And I also noticed among the students that when this conflict arose, that there were codependent young women who were being seduced into thinking that other people's experiences were more important than their own. So it's more important to look at how this very small group of people, the trans people, suffered, and to allow that to eclipse looking at the whole history of women, and allow that to eclipse looking at their own experience. And I thought that this was from codependency of young women who didn't think that their own issues were important enough to look at. And that's what I saw the dynamic of happening in the class. And the problem is it took us 50 years to fight, to resist, reclaim, and imagine and reimagine the history of women that had been left and suppressed and left out and buried. And now, once we've dug it up, it's being buried again, and it's happening very quickly under this ideology of the trans cult. And so I think that the gender identity dominance and the queer studies dominance are being inserted over what women's studies was originally. And I think it's really a shame. I just wanted to show this image and talk about how, the burning of the professor, we're not so far from witch burning. And that's exactly what the experience was for me trying to teach radical feminism where a trans culture was dominant in the university. It used to be, all the years I worked in academia, that to go to the women's lands and to go to the women's music festivals was a place to get reinforced about what my identity was and what I was trying to bring to the university. But those platforms have been eroded too by the same invasion of the trans culture. And so I find that there is a need. I do a lot of intergenerational work on the journal and on the land that I have. And there are women who are really thirsty and starving to find out what it is that we know that we're not allowed to offer in either of those venues anymore.